The rhythmic clucking of chickens filled the backyard as Jake scattered feet across the ground. The golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows over the wooden coop he had built himself. It was his sanctuary, a small slice of peace in an otherwise monotonous suburban existence. Then came the knock. Sharp, deliberate, impatient. Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and sighed. He already knew who it was. The same knock had come every week for the past month, always at the most inconvenient times. When he opened the door, there she stood, Linda Barlow, self-appointed queen of the HOA. She had the look of someone who relished conflict. Arms crossed, lips pursed, an expression of smug satisfaction like she had already won whatever argument she was about to start. You need to get rid of those chickens. Her voice was clipped, rehearsed. We've had complaints. Jake leaned against the doorframe. Yeah. From who? Linda's eyes flickered for the briefest moment before she recovered. That's not your concern. The HOA has regulations and your little farm project is violating them. Jake knew she was lying. He had checked the bylaws. Backyard chickens were allowed as long as they were properly enclosed and well maintained. But Linda had made it her personal mission to make his life miserable. They're within the rules, Jake said evenly. Linda scoffed. They're loud. They stink. This is a neighborhood, not some backwoods hillbilly commune. Jake clenched his jaw. He had grown up here. His grandfather had lived in this house before him, long before Linda moved in and decided to police the entire street. The chickens were more than just pets. They were a connection to something real, something tangible in a world that increasingly felt controlled by people like Linda, people who wielded power through paperwork and petty complaints. I'm not getting rid of them, Jake said firmly. Linda's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. Fine. Have it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you. With that, she turned on her heel and strode back toward her house, her perfectly manicured lawn standing in stark contrast to Jake's more natural, homey yard. The door slammed behind her, but Jake knew this wasn't over. It never was. The next morning, an official-looking letter from the HOA arrived in his mailbox. A formal notice of violation. Linda hadn't wasted any time. He read the paper twice, shaking his head. A fine. An actual fine, citing excessive noise complaints and unsanitary conditions. Well, his chickens weren't loud. They weren't messy. If anything, they were quieter than the yappy little dog that Linda let bark at all hours of the night. Jake considered ignoring it, but he knew that was exactly what Linda wanted, to pile on fines until he had no choice but to comply. So he did what any rational person would do. He gathered his records, took photos of his clean coop and prepared his case. That Saturday he attended the HOA meeting. It was held in the community center, an overly polished building with fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly overhead. Linda sat at the head of the table, her clipboard in front of her, acting as if she were presiding over a courtroom rather than a gathering of homeowners. Jake waited patiently as they droned on about lawn maintenance violations and approved fence colors. When it was his turn, he stood, clearing his throat. I received a violation notice about my chickens, he said, keeping his voice calm. But I reviewed the HOA bylaws and I'm not in violation. Linda barely looked up. We've had multiple complaints. I'd like to see them, Jake said. That got her attention. She shifted in her seat. We don't disclose private complaints. Convenient. Jake exhaled slowly. Then I'd like to formally contest the fine. One of the board members, an older man named Tom, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, glanced between Jake and Linda. If the chickens are allowed under the bylaws, what's the issue? Linda gave a tight-lipped smile. The issue, Tom, is that we have to consider the comfort of the entire community. One person's rights don't outweigh everyone else's. Jake crossed his arms. So, whose comfort are we prioritizing? Because I've spoken to my direct neighbors and none of them have complained. Silence. Tom scratched his chin. Another board member flipped through papers, clearly unsure of how to proceed. But Linda? She met Jake's gaze with thinly veiled contempt. I suppose we'll have to do a follow-up inspection, she said finally. Jake nodded. Fine by me. But the look in her eyes told him she wasn't done. Not even close. A few days later, animal control showed up at his door. The officer, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes, glanced at his clipboard. We got a report about possible animal welfare concerns. Jake exhaled sharply. Let me guess, Linda Barlow? The officer gave a knowing sigh. Not my place to say, but you wouldn't be the first person she's filed complaints against. Jake led him to the backyard, where the chickens clucked happily in their well-maintained coop. The officer did a quick inspection, checked their food and water, and gave an approving nod. "No issues here," he said, scribbling something on his clipboard. "I'll file the report, but you might want to brace yourself. Some folks like to make this a war of attrition." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He knew exactly what Linda was doing. She was trying to exhaust him, to bury him under so many complaints and fines that he'd give up. But that's where she miscalculated. Jake wasn't the kind of guy who backed down. That night, as he sat on his porch, sipping a beer and listening to the gentle rustle of the trees, he thought about his next move. He couldn't just keep playing defense. Linda had been making his life hell over some chickens. Maybe it was time to find out what skeletons she had in her closet. Jake didn't have to wait long for Linda's next move. 3 days after the animal control visit, a second HOA notice arrived, this time citing unauthorized structures on his property. He frowned at the absurdity. His coop wasn't new. It had been there for years, built to code, well within the property lines. But this wasn't about rules. This was about Linda flexing her authority, seeing how far she could push him before he broke. He wasn't going to break. That afternoon he walked the perimeter of his yard, inspecting every inch for anything that could be remotely considered a violation. He took pictures of the coop, the fencing, even the neatly stacked bags of feed by his shed. Nothing was out of place. Nothing Linda could legitimately use against him. So what was her angle? Jake needed to get ahead of her. The problem with people like Linda was that they thrived on control. They relied on fear, on people rolling over the moment things got inconvenient. But bullies always had weak spots. He just had to find hers. Later that evening, he grabbed a beer and settled into his usual routine of scrolling through the local community forum. It was mostly a mix of neighborhood gossip, lost pet notices, and people complaining about property taxes. Nothing unusual, until a particular listing caught his eye. A rental. A beautifully staged home, modern furnishings, elegant decor. The kind of place that looked straight out of a real estate magazine. But it wasn't the house itself that stopped him. It was the address. Linda's house. Jake sat forward, reading through the description. A luxury getaway in a quiet, exclusive neighborhood, available for short-term stays. Guests raved about their experiences in the reviews, mentioning the spacious rooms, the privacy, the attentive host. A slow grin spread across Jake's face. This was gold. He clicked through the images, mentally comparing them to the last time he'd been inside Linda's place during a block party a couple of years ago. Some things had changed, fresh paint, some new furniture, but one detail remained the same. The HOA had strict rules against short-term rentals. No Airbnbs, no VRBOs, nothing under a 30-day lease. It was one of the few regulations that actually made sense. The neighborhood had fought to keep corporate investors from buying up homes and turning them into revolving door rentals. Linda had been one of the loudest voices in that fight. And yet, here she was, secretly profiting from the very thing she claimed to oppose. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. She really thought she was untouchable. The next few days were spent gathering proof. He took screenshots of the listing, noting the dates it had been active. He even managed to find older versions of the page through cached data, showing that Linda had been running this rental for over a year. All under the radar. Then he set up an account under a different name and booked a stay. The moment his reservation was confirmed, he knew he had her. That weekend, Jake arrived at Linda's house under the guise of a guest. He wore a hoodie and sunglasses, keeping a low profile as he checked in. The process was seamless. Linda had left a keypad code for entry, along with a note about the Wi-Fi and house rules. He walked through the home, taking mental notes. Cameras in the corners, standard security, but likely not monitored in real time. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh paint, suggesting recent renovations. In the hallway he found a locked closet that wasn't there before. Curious. He spent the night documenting everything. Photos of the guest book, which showed dozens of previous visitors. A recording of a phone call with Linda, where she casually mentioned how profitable the rental had been. Even a video of the backyard where she had installed an outdoor hot tub, another violation of HOA rules. By the time he checked out, he had more than enough ammunition. But he wasn't ready to pull the trigger just yet. Jake wanted to make sure when Linda fell, she fell hard. So he took one final step. The following Monday he compiled everything, screenshots, recordings, images, and sent it to the city's zoning enforcement office. No names, no direct accusations, just a simple inquiry about whether short-term rentals were allowed in their neighborhood. 2 days later, an inspector showed up at Linda's house. And Jake? He just sat back and waited. Linda had no idea what was coming. Jake watched from his front porch as a white city vehicle rolled to a stop in front of her house. The inspector, a tall man with a clipboard and a no-nonsense expression, stepped out. He adjusted his badge, took a quick glance at the address, and marched up to Linda's front door. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt something close to satisfaction. Linda answered after the third knock, her expression immediately shifting from curiosity to barely contained irritation. She was used to being the one making complaints, not the one answering to them. Jake wished he could hear the conversation, but from the way her posture stiffened, he could tell the inspector wasn't here for a friendly chat. She tried to talk her way out of it. Her arms moved in sharp, defensive gestures, her mouth pulling into that tight, forced smile she used when she was pretending to be reasonable. The inspector wasn't buying it. He gestured toward the house, stepped inside, and closed the door behind him. Jake grinned, taking a slow sip of his coffee. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. When the inspector finally emerged, Linda was right behind him, her expression stormy. The kind of look she usually reserved for Jake and his chickens. She was arguing. Of course she was. Probably trying to play the victim, spinning some excuse about how she didn't know short-term rentals weren't allowed. But the inspector wasn't interested in her excuses. He handed her a slip of paper, probably a notice of violation, and walked briskly back to his vehicle. The moment he pulled away, Linda stormed back inside and slammed the door so hard that her decorative wreath shook. Jake could almost hear her seething from across the street. That was just the beginning. 2 days later, another official notice arrived in Linda's mailbox. And this time it wasn't just from the city, it was from the HOA. Word had spread. Jake had made sure of that. He had sent the evidence not just to the authorities, but to the HOA board, a few select neighbors, and even the local community Facebook group. Nothing malicious, just a simple post raising the question. Anyone else surprised to see a short-term rental in our exclusive, no Airbnb neighborhood? The reaction was immediate. Neighbors who had been passive before, who had tolerated Linda's power trips, who had shrugged off her constant rule enforcing, suddenly had opinions. They were furious. Furious that she had lorded the HOA rules over everyone else while secretly cashing in behind their backs. Furious that she had been making thousands while fining people over mailbox colors and lawn height. By the end of the week, Linda's world was unraveling. The HOA called an emergency meeting. The kind of meeting that Linda usually controlled, but this time she wasn't in charge. Jake arrived early, taking a seat near the back, enjoying the rare feeling of being on the winning side. The room buzzed with energy, whispers, side conversations, neighbors exchanging knowing glances. At the front, the HOA board members sat in a row, their expressions grim. Linda sat stiffly in her usual chair, lips pressed so tightly together they looked bloodless. She knew what was coming. The meeting started with formalities, but it didn't take long to get to the main event. One of the board members, Tom, the same one who had questioned her about Jake's chickens, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. It has come to our attention that a certain homeowner has been operating an unregistered short-term rental in clear violation of our bylaws. He didn't say her name, but every eye in the room turned to Linda. She didn't move. Tom continued, his voice calm but firm. The HOA does not take these violations lightly. Given the extent of the rental activity, the board has voted to impose the maximum fine allowable. A murmur spread through the room. The fine was steep, thousands of dollars. Enough to make even someone like Linda feel it. One of the other board members, a middle-aged woman who had always seemed to tolerate Linda more than most, shook her head. Linda, you fought so hard to keep short-term rentals out of this neighborhood. What exactly were you thinking? Linda finally snapped. This is ridiculous. I was providing a service. It's my house and I should be able to do what I want with it. Tom raised an eyebrow. So should Jake. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's face flushed deep red. She opened her mouth to argue, but there was nothing left to say. She had spent months harassing Jake over imaginary rule violations, and now she was caught breaking one of the biggest HOA rules herself. There was no recovering from this. Jake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching as Linda's carefully constructed facade crumbled. For the first time in a long time she had nothing to say. Linda didn't show her face for a week. For someone who thrived on control, who strutted through the neighborhood as if she personally owned every square foot of it, her sudden disappearance was almost jarring. Her porch light stayed off. The perfectly curated flower beds at the front of her house started to wilt, untended. The pristine white shutters remained closed, sealing her inside like a queen in exile. But silence wasn't surrender. Jake knew that much. She was plotting. The fine from the HOA had been brutal. Several $1,000s, a financial hit no one wanted to take. Worse, the city had slapped her with an additional penalty for running an illegal rental, complete with the possibility of a zoning violation lawsuit if she didn't remove the modifications she had made to her house. The cherry on top? A permanent ban on any rental activity under her name. For the first time, Linda Barlow had rules imposed on her. And she hated it. Jake didn't celebrate too early. He had seen people like her before, people who lashed out when they felt cornered. He expected retaliation. What he didn't expect was just how desperate she would become. It started small. A noise complaint against him. An official report to the city about suspicious activity at his property. Both dismissed within hours. Then one morning he woke to find his garbage bins knocked over, trash scattered across his driveway. A coincidence? Maybe. But when he checked his security camera footage, he wasn't surprised to see a shadowy figure slipping out of view just past midnight. Linda wasn't done fighting. She just didn't have any moves left that weren't petty. That's what made it so satisfying when she made her final, fatal mistake. A week later, on a bright Saturday morning, a moving truck pulled into Linda's driveway. Jake sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching as two men climbed out and started carrying furniture out of her house. A sofa. A dining table. Boxes. Linda stood in the doorway, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. She had lost. But it wasn't the moving truck that sealed it, it was the car that arrived just after. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows, pulling up behind the truck like a shark sensing blood. A man in a crisp suit stepped out, adjusting his tie as he glanced at the house. Then he pulled a folder from his briefcase and marched toward Linda. Jake didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. Foreclosure. Rumors had already started swirling in the neighborhood. The fines had pushed Linda into financial trouble. And with her short-term rental income cut off, she had no way to cover the costs. She had bet everything on her ability to outmaneuver the system, only to find herself crushed beneath it. Linda tried to argue, her hands moving furiously as she spoke. But the man didn't flinch. He simply handed her the papers, said something brief and turned back toward his car. A legal eviction notice. Linda stood frozen, staring at the document in her hands. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of her own arrogance had finally collapsed in on her. Jake took another sip of coffee, savoring the moment. He wasn't cruel. He didn't revel in the suffering of others. But there was something undeniably satisfying about karma running its course. By noon the moving truck was full. Linda stood by the curb, watching as the last of her belongings were loaded up. For the first time in years she looked powerless. Not the smug, condescending tyrant who had ruled over the neighborhood with an iron fist. Just a woman who had pushed too hard, too far, and lost everything. She turned suddenly, her eyes locking onto Jake's. For a moment he thought she might say something. A final insult. A desperate plea. Some last-ditch attempt to claw back even the smallest shred of dignity. But she didn't. Instead, she turned, climbed into her car, and drove away. The house she left behind sat empty. A silent monument to a battle she had started, and lost. Jake finished his coffee, leaned back in his chair, and listened to the soft clucking of his chickens in the yard. It was a good day.